This is the DRS train.
Welcome to the DRS Train podcast. This service is the misadventures of Merzario. I'm your driver, Peter Brook, and your conductors today are Nav F1 and a new guest, Nedzo's F1 Grid Box. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hi, Peter. Looking forward to this episode on yet another backmarker.
Yeah, same. Hello, I'm new.
So, Nedzo, you're relatively new to the F1 content creation game, so you just want to tell everyone quickly what kind of videos you make?
Basically, I just do loads of old teams, but rather than doing the classic kind of cliche old teams like your HRTs, like you've made a career off, and Lotuses and Marussias, I just go back to the 70s, back to the 80s, the likes of Coloni. I've done a video on Token, which is another really obscure team from the mid-70s. Just because they often have very quirky or interesting stories and they're not very well known. I like to inform people and myself about things that people wouldn't usually know about.
Yeah, so on that note, we got you on because we wanted to discuss a driver and team from the 1970s, which is Arturo Merzario. For most people, including myself, their extent of their knowledge of him might be that he was the Italian guy that wore a cowboy hat and he also saved Niki Lauda's life in 1976. What would you say were some of his other more defining qualities as a driver?
I mean, he's not just known for F1. He has had some success in other series. He is just one of those Italian drivers who drove for Ferrari in the 70s. He's one of those that you always remember, along with maybe Ernesto Brambilla, Ignacio Giunti, as the driver who raced the Italian drivers who raced for Ferrari in the 70s. Like I said, he drove for a lot of other teams, kind of like your classic midfield to lower back marker teams. But yeah, he was very much if he wasn't for the fact he owned his own team, he would very much be lost in the record books as another average midfield driver that no one really knows about.
Yeah, because I suppose when you look at his results, he got a few points finishes with Ferrari and then a couple when he joined Frank Williams Racing Cars, but beyond that, not really much more. Things kind of went downhill a bit because we've had a lot of drivers, a lot of champions in particular started their own teams. I mean, we've seen Jackie Stewart, John Surtees, Graham Hill, etc., etc. He was one of the other ones, similar to people like Chris Amon from that time that started teams, and it just didn't really work, unfortunately.
One of the ways I saw Merzario recently is when obviously Lewis Hamilton moved to Ferrari, and then they posted all the drivers who had raced for Ferrari across their 70-year history. And I realized that in 1973, when Merzario gets dropped from Ferrari to go to Williams, it was one or two times where Ferrari completely changed their lineup from one year to the other. So the most obvious one is from 95 to 96 when they get Schumacher. But in 1973 they drop Merzario and then he goes to Williams. So he did race for some famous names, but he was one of those drivers that back then would not really make a name for himself in Formula 2 or single seaters from Formula racing, but he would come in for sports car racing, and obviously that became much less common as years went by. And he just got lost in one of those years where Ferrari were just not the team we know nowadays, or even we know from the noughties. They were just not there at all. You wouldn't even consider them to be a front runner or even a consistent point score.
Yeah, absolutely. I do agree with a lot of that. The reason why he got dropped, I have looked at other things like this. The reason why he got dropped from Ferrari in 73 was because Enzo Ferrari thought that one of the ways he could get the team back up to the top was to go for a completely different driver lineup. I don't know if Jackie Ickx had left by that point. I think he might have, but I know that Andrea Diadamic was racing for the team in 73. And yeah, that was one of the reasons why he got dumped from Ferrari, because Enzo just wanted another like a reshuffle to try and make the team better. You mentioned he drove for Frank Williams. He did drive for Frank Williams Racing Cars. He also drove for a couple of other well-ish known teams. Fittipaldi, he drove for Copa-Sucar Fittipaldi, which is obviously Emerson Fittipaldi's, or Wilson Fittipaldi technically, his own team. He drove for Walter Wolf Racing as well before they became big. Obviously, Walter Wolf Racing won a couple of races with Scheckter in, was it 77 or 78? I think it was 77.
They won on their debut when they became their own constructor.
Yeah. Yeah, and then obviously Merzario made his own team. Because I think Wikipedia says he designed his own cars. I don't know how much that is true because he's a racing driver. I don't know if he did have any. He didn't say he had any sort of engineering degrees because I know a lot of drivers did have engineering degrees of some sort back in those days. But he apparently did design his own cars, which is a bit of a unknown fact you could say, because like you mentioned, Peter, the likes of John Surtees, Graham Hill, and a couple of Jack Brabham, obviously, and Bruce McLaren made their own teams and Chris Amon. But to have a driver design their own cars as well is a bit of an unusual kind of quirk.
Yeah, and well, we're getting into the design of the actual cars now, so I think we have to address the elephant in the room in terms of Mercario's F1 contributions, which is his help towards his assistance towards Niki Lauda in the big crash. So famously, he was the one who stepped in the fire to remove Lauda from the car. And Lauda was so grateful that he famously gave him a golden Rolex that was his for like 2 or 3 years, I think. So one of his most prized possessions. So even though he was not a memorable driver, he still maybe did one of the most important things in Formula One's history by taking Lauda out of that car.
Yeah, it's one of those ones that it's similar to someone like David Purley, who is relatively unknown for his racing, but is famous because of his attempts to try and save Roger Williamson's life in 1973. That you end up making a name for yourself in a different way. In a more modern sense, I mean, obviously Romain Grosjean is famous for crashing a lot, but obviously the Bahrain crash is what most people know him for now. And Zhou Guanyu, it seems like with the way his career is going, he'll probably only be known for his crash at Silverstone by the end of it. So some people they get famous for different things and that. But it was for him it was a bit of a transition because this happened to be his first race with Wolf Williams because he was driving for March for the first half of the season. And then moved to Wolf, and he didn't finish that race, and he didn't finish any others with them that year. And then it was when he made his own team afterwards. Yeah,
that relationship with March was probably a good one because going into the actual team now, he would be one of several team owners in 1977 to use March as entries for their backmarkers or lower midfielders. And to be fair, 1977, the first season of Merzario, they were seen as one of the fastest March entries. They were only recorded as having one finish in P14 in Belgium. But in terms of actual pace, they were credited as maybe one of the teams who got the setups the best or just understood how to make it work.
I remember looking when I was looking through the team, and I saw what would usually happen for them is they'd usually qualify first or second because I think there was some races they did have to go through pre-qualifying, even in the 70s, which I didn't really know about. But when they did get through pre-qualifying, they'd usually get into the race and then they'd retire about 25 to 30 laps in with some sort of gearbox or transmission or some other engine, like some other common mechanical fault that they'd usually have. So it seems that typical of the era, really, that they could qualify well, but sometimes the cars would just blow up on them, or not blow up, but have problems on them.
Yeah, I mean, in some cases, I think that there is evidence that a lot of teams, maybe more recent ones, knew that the car was not going to finish the race, so they might just deliberately put no fuel in it, so it makes it look faster than it is. It wouldn't surprise me, but yeah, I mean, this is just a general point. It's also kind of appalling, I think, that for most of F1's history, this is the pinnacle of motorsport with the world's greatest engineers. And for most of its history, they can't build a car that can run for 90 minutes without breaking down. I mean, only in the past few years, we've got to a point where we're getting where mechanical retirements are really rare. But it was especially bad in the 70s, and the cars were very rickety, and they were all using the same gearboxes. And half the time, you could bust the gearbox by putting it in the wrong gear by accident because the stick would shake around as you're driving about. It was just it was a problem. A lot of the older the smaller teams especially had was not even just making the car fast, but making it actually able to finish the race in the first place.
That's the issue I think that happened, because obviously when you're building a car, you have to choose either pace or reliability or a mix of both. And I think nowadays it is more a mix of both. But back in the 70s, especially with like the lack of technical knowledge they had at the time, I think it was a lot easier. Like, even if you prioritize reliability, you'd be like 12 seconds off the pace. Like, I think the biggest example, not from that era, but that I can think of, is 40, when Forti designed their 1995 car, Guido Forti said he wanted to prioritize reliability over everything else. And the couple of races that they did qualify for, they weren't classified. They were like 7, 8, 9 laps down, and they were genuinely 9 laps down on pace.
Yeah, I mean, it was a car that one. The reliability, to be fair, it was relatively good for a backmarker 90s team. But yeah, the pace was just bad. That was the thing. They'd sacrificed a bit too much. It was just too slow. And it was, again, that was the last F1 car to use a manual gearbox as well, which probably didn't help them either. But yeah, so if we look at, after, I mean, 77, they were using that March, which was relatively competitive, but as it went on, it just got less and less competitive, and then he gave up a few races before the end because for 1978 he tried to make his own car. And this again, it was kind of a similar deal, really. A few failures to qualify, and quite a few failures to qualify, and no classified finishes at the end.
I think there was one fact that I picked up that was he did a partnership with a guy called, I'm going to pronounce his first name wrong, Guglielmo Bellassi. And the Bellassi part is the bit I remember because Bellassi was a small backmarker team from the early 70s. And that, I think, could have had like you got a backmarker team collaborating with a backmarker team that was also very terrible earlier on.
It's there was it was a very different kind of system back then because a lot of it you even in the 70s, because by this point F1 was getting into its commercial era and it was becoming this kind of big glamorous sport, whereas in the 1950s it was very much a sort of ragtag, kind of a rich boys club, and there were a lot of genuine amateurs who would just buy a car cheaply and just change it up a bit and usually make it worse in the process. By the 70s, there were some people still could do that. They could buy usually a March and just make a couple of changes to it, and bam, that's their car. And they might have one car with very few spare parts. It's not like today where there's two cars, and when we used to have a third car they could jump into if the other one broke. You just had the one car, but you could still get an entry into Formula One with it. But even if it didn't work, they were very loose in terms of entry requirements at the time.
Yeah, I mean, like, the biggest example of an actual successful team that used like a March as a basis, because there was a couple of other teams like Shadow and Ensign that did supply chassis. Hesketh used a modified March. It was some sort of March chassis. I don't know the exact number. Designed by and they got Harvey Postlethwaite to do some work on the car. So maybe, obviously, because as you said, some other teams did do kind of some minor adjustments. Maybe they actually needed someone who was half competent, like a Harvey Postlethwaite, who knew what he was doing to design whatever they wanted.
And the amazing thing with that car in 1978, so obviously Arturo thought that having his own car designed by, as you said, Nedzo, we don't know if it was himself, which would be unlikely, or some kind of team behind him. But, he was decent in qualifying in 1977. It wasn't that bad, whereas his own car never qualified in the top 20, from what I see. And what amazes me with most of those backmarkers from the 70s and 80s, it's just the sheer willpower to keep going. It's the fact you probably will never score a point unless half the grid crashes out and it's raining and the other half just gets a mechanical issue. So that's more of an open question to you. Why do you think they just kept going? Was it just the thrill of F1, of owning an F1 team, or is it more that you make an investment and it's more of nowadays when someone just starts a company and realizes they have to keep going? And
they did it for the love of the sport. They did it because, like, the reason why they were called like privateers was because they were privateer racers who just wanted to race. You like in the 50s, thing you mentioned, back in the 50s, it was just an old rich boys club who there were a lot of amateurs and a lot of people who weren't very good. I think Ottorino Volontario springs to mind, who was known for being one of the worst racers of all time because he was just awful. And that tradition kind of carried through until the early 80s when, like, for example, non-championship races started falling out of favor, customer chassis started falling out of favor. I think that was just a product of the time, because F1 as a whole, I mean, although it was entering its commercial era, it was a lot less serious and there was a lot more. It was kind of a closed not as much as it is now, but it was a closed kind of club, and people wanted a piece of that, even if it wasn't to be winning races or scoring points, as you said. I think because you said they're very unlikely to score points unless we had it wasn't uncommon to see like 2 or 3 races per season where 6 or 7 cars finished a race, but because they're in a back market team with less money, they were more likely to be one of those cars that retired, so they were much less likely to get good in an attritional race.
Yeah, a name that comes to mind on that is, of course, Lella Lombardi, when she scored half a point at Spain in 1975, when otherwise she was kind of at or near the back. I mean, that was an especially chaotic race because there was a crash and 5 spectators died and they cancelled the race early. But yeah, it was one of these things, and this continued well into the 90s, that even as a back marker, you could think, oh, well, if we just keep it on the track and the gearbox holds out, we could get some points here, even if we qualified 26th, because most of the cars didn't work. Whereas these days, there's no chance. Like Williams and Logan Sargent, if he qualifies last, he's going to finish last. He's not going to make gains from people breaking down or anything. But we saw. I mean, by the late 80s, when we suddenly saw a massive surge in new teams, and that's when we got the comedy teams like Life and Andrea Moda and Pacific. They were still kind of bad, but they were more professional, and it was almost more difficult because the amount of money that you needed was much higher to run a team like that, even though it was still not very good.
Yeah, I fully agree, especially because I was going to ask as well, those teams you mentioned as being more professional, they had drivers that they had to seek out. They had to look for sponsors. They had to, basically, the team owner had to find people to drive for him, or drivers would ask to be there. It wasn't the team owner making a team for himself. Whereas in the 70s, you had loads of drivers like Merzario, because we didn't mention that. He was basically the only driver of his team. For the 3 years where they were in F1, I think, so yeah, only 2 races had a second driver enter. Actually, 1 race had a second driver enter. He didn't even pre-qualify. He didn't go past the pre-qualification. And then in 1979, he couldn't enter the race and asked another Italian to enter a race. Do you also think that, I know Nedzo was praising how they just wanted a piece of it and wanted to be part of the game. Do you also think it's a reluctance to understand that, your time might be done in F1? Because we saw a lot of those drivers after leaving big teams and realizing, okay, we might not be getting anything big soon. They just create a team, race there for 2 or 3 years, and it just looks to me, at least, that it's them just having a bit of fun.
I completely agree with a lot of what you've just said. Like, I think the biggest example of a driver who was past it, who created his own team just to have a bit of fun, was Graham Hill. Like, as much as I think he's one of the most underrated champions I've ever seen, no one ever talks about him because everyone just talks about Jim Clark and Jackie Stewart and people like that. After his legs broke in Watkins Glen in 1969, he wasn't the same driver at all. He got a couple of points finishes in 1970, and then he fell off into obscurity. Created his own team, and to be fair, he was racing into his mid-40s, which was a very rare point. Like, he retired in 1975 after he failed to qualify for the Monaco Grand Prix, and he was 46. You never saw that at that point, or really ever since. So maybe that was part of it, and he started racing because he was past it. I mean, Merzario, how old would he have been when he started his team? So let me just quickly do some... He was born in, I think, 43, wasn't it? Yeah, he was born in 1943. So by the time he'd got to Merzario, he was 34, which is... You're getting to especially in the 70s, you're getting towards the end of your career, especially if you are a midfield driver who hasn't won a race or hasn't won a championship, who hasn't got a legacy to fall back on. So I think definitely you could say that Merzario's entry and his creating his own team was because he thought he wasn't going to get a seat anywhere else.
Yeah, I think sometimes a lot of it is just for the fun of it, or because you can't get a seat. Although one rather curious example is Emerson Fittipaldi, because that was obviously done out of loyalty to his brother, but also I think he thought it would be fun to have his own team. But really, I think it should go down as one of the worst kind of career moves in Formula One history, to go from McLaren to Fittipaldi, where there was a couple of, where he spent 6 seasons with them, got a couple of podiums, but a lot of failures to qualify. And I mean, when he retired at 30, which was really, he could have carried on a bit more, or he was in his early 30s, and yeah, he just spent 5 years kind of wasting his time doing that. But that was a whole different kettle of fish compared to Merzario, who kind of was a bit more of a journeyman, whereas Emerson Fittipaldi was a 2-time champion.
Yeah, I think, well, Emerson retired at 30, and then You see, I think he went into bankruptcy at some point during his life. I don't know if it was like immediately after he went to F1, because then, after he left F1, he went to IndyCar in 1984, spent 12 seasons in IndyCar, won the Indy 500 a couple of times, won the IndyCar Championship, I think, a couple of times as well, and retired in 1996. I don't know how old he'd be then. Probably about 45, 46, so getting to the same age that Graham Hill was when he retired.
Yeah, I mean, he had plenty of longevity in him to go to mid-40s. I mean, a similar age to, well, I guess a slightly older than Mansell, but again, he was in his 40s when he retired. I mean, yeah, because he, even a few years back, he entered the I think it was the 24 Hours of Sao Paulo or the 6 Hours of Sao Paulo, and he was 67 years old. So he's still got the energy for it. I mean, we see this even Mario Andretti. He's in his 80s, and he drove a modern Formula One car a few years ago. Some of them are just very spry. And I suppose Merzario is one example because he turns 81 in a couple of weeks, and so that makes him one of the oldest living drivers, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I checked that a couple of weeks ago. The oldest F1 driver, from what I know, the oldest F1 driver currently still alive, if I look on Stats F1, I'm not going to, but I think it's Paul Goldsmith. He raced in the 50s. Obviously, I don't think he had any tenable results. I don't think he got a point, but I think he's like 98, 99.
He only raced in the Indy 500. So he's 90. He turns 99 in October, I think. So he still counts as an F1 driver, even though he only did Indy. The oldest actual F1 driver is Hermano da Silva Ramos, and he's literally 2 months younger. So he just turned 98. It was what was his name? Kenneth McAlpine. He died last year. He was 101. So yeah, I think there are only about 10 drivers from the 1950s that are still alive, but there are quite a few from the 60s and 70s. And yeah, Merzario is on the older side, being 81.
Yeah, we should try to get them as guests for the podcast. I'm sure they'll be very intelligible and will be saying very politically correct things. I was just going back to the last Merzario F1 car in 1979. It's funny because, well, the only race he didn't enter that year was because he injured himself. And then the second time he had to use a previous iteration of the Merzario because he had crashed the only version of the improved car. Which also brings us to talking about how most of those teams, they would have 1 or 2 cars, not more. It's not like today where if a car crashes, if Mick Schumacher in 2022 crashes his house for the 5th time of the weekend, there's a 6th one they can build in, 5 hours, 6 hours? It's incredible nowadays because you used to have to be so careful if you were a privateer, because one crash a week before a Grand Prix could mean that you're not entering the next one, or you have to use some 2-year-old chassis or whatever. And that's basically what he had to do for a race in Austria. And then he got a new chassis, and that chassis was so bad. So he got it from the Carlsen team, and it was rebuilt by De Lara, the famous maker, kind of race car maker. So they made the Merzario A4, and it was atrocious and basically ended the team's tenure into F1. So it's incredible to think that for those privateers, crushing 1 or 2 cars might just lead to the end of the road for them. It's as simple as that. It's not like nowadays where you can at least survive, usually. I know recently with the Braun GP documentary, we also saw how we got a reminder of how even in the late 2000s and obviously early 2010s with the back mode, you had to be careful about the actual car not being able to race because you don't have enough components. And that's what happened with Merzario.
That was a thing that happened in the 70s. It was very much, it was basically, I think Enzo Ferrari coined the term garageistas, because it was just a bunch of blokes in a garage from probably Norfolk or wherever they were from in the UK or Italy or whatever. And they were just bolting a car together in a garage and on a cash-strapped budget. I mean, going back to your point about the Merzario A4, I mean, when you mentioned Carlsen, I chuckled because Carlsen was known for being absolutely terrible. I mean, from what I remember when I did a kind of half video on them, I remember what happened was, I think because obviously they came in 1979 they came in, they basically copied the Lotus 78 chassis. They said, oh, we've seen this guy, or we've seen this team dominate with a chassis, let's just copy it. So they got some designers to copy it, but their budget and the fact that they were cutting corners meant that they created one of the worst chassis in F1 history. I think at best they were like 9 seconds off the pace. So the fact that Merzario bought a car that was 9 seconds off the pace and thought they could do anything with it other than stick it as a teapot on the mantelpiece, I don't know why he took that decision.
I mean, to be fair, the car looks good. I mean, look at the pictures of it, because it's got this nice kind of matte black with a red and yellow stripes going down it. So they got that down. But yeah, this is an interesting point, actually. And this applies to Merzario as well, is the 78, 79 was the transition to ground effect. Because they built their first car in 78, which, like everyone else's, ended up basically becoming obsolete, because that was when the Lotus 79 came in, which kind of got the flexible skirts, and then everyone was like, okay, now we need to copy this. So in 1979, everyone else does ground effects. But you had teams like Ciaron where they try and copy it, and even ATS, they made their own attempt. I think because a lot of people, other than like Gordon Murray, a lot of people hadn't really worked out what they were doing, because you couldn't see what the underside of the car. ATS basically put skirts on the side of the car, but I don't think they put aerofoils in. So they just created a tube on the side of the car that doesn't actually do anything, because they didn't realize what was going on. And so that kind of, this is where everyone was trying to go in the direction of building them. But Merzario's, like, again, they had ground effects on the 79 car, but it maybe wasn't so good because they still had these enormous wings and very, very high airbox, even though it was banned. They've got like two square slits of air behind the driver. So it's kind of a slightly odd design in many ways.
It's funny, we were talking about how some drivers would just make their own team to just not retire. The only time the A4 that lost Merzario, that race in F1, was not slowest was because Hector Rebaque's team was slower. Another backmarker, which I'm sure Nedzo will probably touch upon in maybe one of his own episodes or in our podcast again, a team that is the prime example of what we were talking about earlier in terms of why do some of those drivers or just people generally make those teams in the 70s. The Rebaque was extremely slow and was a bit of a laughing stock at some point at the start of its tenure, so in 1978, because it couldn't even qualify in the first half of 1978, and then it gets a point in Germany. So it still somehow just gets a point from a random race of attrition. And I think the person who, he scored the only point of his team, and he finished a minute and a half behind the top two. So when you look at those examples, it just shows you why those teams even existed. It was this desperate hope that a point could happen somewhere for some reason.
I mean, Rebaque was a different story, because Hector Rebaque, rather than ending his career by starting his own team, he started his, from what I think he might have done like one race for March or Ensign or another small team in the 76 season. But I think in 77, he created Rebaque to propel his own F1 career, and then later went on to drive for Brabham, which is what everyone mainly knows him for, because of James Hunt saying that Rebaque is not a world-class driver in any way. Because that's what he said, I think it was at the Brazilian Grand Prix in 81, where he said, because Rebaque was teammate to Nelson Piquet and was holding up, I think it was either John Watson or Carlos Reutemann who was holding up in that race, and James Hunt, being James Hunt, said, this guy is worthless, why is he in the top car?
Yeah. Meanwhile, his teammate won the championship. It was that sort of thing, because his team. I mean, he was interesting in terms of people imitating Lotus. Is he literally just took it because he bought the Lotus 78 in 1978, so the year after it was used, and then he managed to get the Lotus 79 for 1979. I mean, by that point, though, obviously partly his own driving skill, but also how quickly the cars developed. They were basically obsolete, because in 1978, he scored 1 point and had several failures to qualify. 1979, only 2 failures to qualify, but then he did enter his own car, which was the Rebaque HR100, which itself, I think the base car was a Lotus 79. And that did only 3 races, and he failed to qualify for 2 of them. So it just kind of shows more quickly how first of all, how quickly the cars were developing, but also you really needed to know what you were doing in terms of design and actually how to make this work, rather than just rather crudely copying the likes of Ferrari, Williams, and Lotus that had these like top tier mechanics and engineers.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of the thing of the time to just copy and I mean, we saw with Tracing Point a couple of years ago, and we've seen it a couple of times before, where teams will just copy whatever's popular. I mean, it is basically the thing of F1. If you can't get it banned, you copy it. And that is very much what they did back in the 70s. Like, as you said, with Merzario, with Rebaque. I'm trying to think of another. I think there must have been some other team that used like a Lotus chassis. I can't think, but I think every team was trying to get a bit of the Lotus 78, 79 pie. And because Lotus were the pioneers of that time, I think that kind of went through up until the 88 chassis of 1980, where I think the FIA had finally had enough of Colin Chapman finding loopholes in rule sets, and that's where he went to the whole DeLorean scandal and the whole thing surrounding his death.
I mean, the 80 or the 88 was the one where basically the entire car was a Venturi tunnel, because you could see there were skirts on the nose cone, and that one it should have worked but didn't, because it ended up porpoising like crazy. And then there was or was it the 88 was the twin chassis one?
The 88 was the twin chassis.
Yeah, that one. I mean, the drivers loved it, and it was meant to be really comfortable because he was sat in this seat and cockpit that would just kind of bounce really, really comfortably and swing back and forth while the rest of the car's going like Billy-O over the bumps or whatever. But yeah, because it counted as a movable aerodynamic device, they had to shelve that. But that was also actually technically that was the first carbon fiber Formula One car. It wasn't the first one to race because it got banned. It was McLaren's one that year that was carbon fiber. And then John Watson has that huge crash at Monza, walks away unscathed, and everyone's like, okay, this is the way to go. This is so much safer than aluminium, which they've been using. Every team up until that point had been using. I think in the 60s, there were a couple of teams that tried fiberglass. There was one team that made a car out of wood, which, would you believe, never caught on. And again, there was experiments with magnesium, which after two drivers got incinerated in those cars, that was never used again. There were a lot of innovations around late 70s, early 80s.
I think the materials speaking of materials, I think when ground effects started coming in, I can't remember which. I think it might have been either Lotus or Williams when they were testing ground effect and suction cars in the early 80s. The aluminium was the sheer downforce was literally warping the aluminium, so the car was bending as it was going around the circuit.
Yeah, Ligier had that. The suspension was bending. I mean, Ligier had they'd put flaps in the skirts as well to sort of mediate it, and that got done for being a movable aerodynamic device as well. So that was another reason they had to go to carbon fiber.
Yeah, they always did weird things in the 70s and 80s, that's for sure. Another thing with, going back to Merzario, is in 1980, they thought that they had made a car, the M1, that could suit both the BMW engine and the Cosworth engine. Now, imagine that was the case in the 2010s, 2020s. You'd build a car around an engine, not the opposite. And they thought, you could just interchange engines if they wanted to. Well, obviously, the car never raced in 1980, so we never got to see it. And they only used the BMW engine in Formula 2. What was the recent car I think in the 2010s, where they had to cram an engine that wasn't expected to be there in a chassis because they had expected to get another engine supplier, and then last minute they had put another one.
Not the 2010s, but the two examples that come to mind are Super Aguri and Braun, because Braun were meant to have it was built with Honda, and then they pulled out, and then they shoved that Mercedes in the back and just about made it work. With Super Aguri, because their first car was the Arrows A23, which had a Cosworth V10, they had a Honda V8. And I think they managed to get it in, but they had problems because it didn't line up with the gearbox properly. So that meant the center of gravity was really high. You could sort of get away with it more back then because 1982 or 83, when Brabham first started using turbo engines, they trialed because they had the BMW M1, and that was the one they used throughout the 80s, which was the really big turbo engine of that era that went up to like 1,400 horsepower. They tried that for one race and it didn't work, and then they just crudely threw the Cosworth DFV back in for the next one. And so the cars, I think, because the aerodynamic and the engineering finesse was not really anywhere near as precise as it is now, you could just about get away with it. Because in modern cars, the reason it usually doesn't work is because if it's a different shape, you have to redesign the engine cover. That's going to mess up the rear wing and the diffuser, and then you also have to make sure it actually lines up. It will connect with the gearbox properly, and that affects the suspension. Everything is all it's like a kit car. It's all meant to go together, whereas back then you could be a bit more hodgepodge with it.
I mean, I think there is a modern example of that. I can't remember which team it was. I was watching a video on YouTube the other week that said that the reason why certain teams have had problems, like apparently Haas's tyre wear problems or Sauber's problem that they've had in the recent years, are because the engine, them not understanding how the engine and the gearbox casing works. I think Sauber this year are for the first time in a while using their own gearbox casing.
That could be it, but you'd hope with Haas that since this has been going on for 8 years now, that they would have found a solution, but it seems not.
Well, you're banking on Haas to find solutions, which they have been trying to do for the last 3 years, and it's really working out.
I mean, realistically, I think Haas either needs to go or needs to get better at this point, because Gene Haas is trying to lowball and bare minimum spend his way into F1, and it's not working for him at the moment. He needs to spend more money, like Gunther Steiner said, if he wants to actually get something out of this project.
Or get bought by Andretti. So we have a sort of modern day Jaguar to Red Bull story. I think that's what that would. Even though there's no analogy to Stewart in this case because Haas started from scratch. But yeah, so a project that was meant to be big and then flopped. Just get bought by Andretti, who can be the next Red Bull.
See, if we were in the 70s or 80s, I feel like Haas could have been a perfect Formula 2 team where, if you weren't good enough in F1, you could just go down to Formula 2 and then it would actually suit their system more where they don't have much money, but they still want to be relevant. Because with Formula 2 being so relevant nowadays, I feel like having Haas there could actually help, and then they can have fun with the liveries and they can actually have some random young drivers, which they seem to like putting in their cars. Because Merzario had gone down to Formula 2, seeing that Formula 1 didn't suit them well. And then Formula 2, first season there, they tried to field their own car again, like they had in 78 and 79 in Formula 1. It went badly. And then in 1981, they go back to using March chassis, and it's working again. So I think it's a very simple conclusion there that whoever was making those Merzario cars didn't really get it, because they were just atrocious for the 3 years, both in Formula 1 and Formula 2, where they tried to make their own thing. But in 1981, they switched to Marches, and for the first time in several years, or maybe even in their history, they were actually decently competitive with one of their drivers scoring back-to-back podiums. And that was about it in terms of their peak. 1981 was the only time where you would ever see a Merzario driver on a podium, and that was in Formula 2.
I mean, your kind of example saying that Haas should go down to F2 and do what Merzario did. I mean, I don't think that'd work nowadays, especially. I think the difference between F1 and F2 has changed. It's like, I think, to give a reference to football, it's like because obviously, like back in the 70s and 80s, the difference between what was Division 1 and Division 2 wasn't exactly that big. It was the money differences and all that sort of stuff, and that everything involved was a lot less. There was a lot less discrepancies. But nowadays, like you look at the Premier League and the Championship, there is so much more money, so much more exposure, so much more everything. And I think it's the same with F1 nowadays, because money. The answer to all your questions is money. The answer to all your questions is money, and I don't think that would work for Haas. And I think that's maybe the reason why it works back in the 70s and 80s, because money wasn't everything back in then. It was about passion. It was about engineering, technical brilliance. It was about copying another team's chassis.
Yeah, because with the privateer teams, we mentioned, the garagistas, that even if you had Ferrari and McLaren and Williams at the top, where everything was a very professional setup and lots of money and lots of really elite mechanics, and it was big business. Even with the ones at the bottom that were really suffering because they had a car that barely worked, they were probably having more fun than the ones at the top, because it was just like a weekend kind of hobby thing, and it was just a group of blokes who built this car together and are trying to make it run in the best peak of motorsport, and that it probably still was a lot of fun just to even be involved. But you can tell that Formula 2, well, both today and back then, was less strenuous, because Merzario did have a lot more staying power. I mean, he got 5 full seasons, 4.5 roughly, in Formula 2, which wasn't bad going, and a couple of podiums, couple of fastest laps, couple of points. It kind of worked, and they had a lot of different drivers drive for them as well.
I mean, I'm just looking at their F2 results now. I'd say for the most part, but only 2 of their drivers. No, actually, I say that 3 of their drivers ever got to F1. Those were, if I look at them, Lamberto Leone, who I recognise from the late 70s, Joe Gartner, who raced for Osella in 1984, and who was the other one I saw? Loris Kessel. He drove, I think, ATS in the late 70s.
Yes, yeah. So not the most notable of drivers. I mean, of the 3, the name that a lot of people know is Joe Gartner, because he was killed in the 1986 24 Hours of Le Mans. But they're not drivers particularly well known for their results. But yeah, it's the same with, obviously, Merzario, he's the main topic. The other 2 drivers, Gianfranco Brancatelli, Alberto Colombo, only entered 1 or 2 races in Formula 1. I know that Alberto Colombo died recently, and Gianfranco Brancatelli, he was actually drove for Sauber Mercedes in Le Mans, and he won. He was on the winning Le Mans team, I think, in '89, or maybe the second place car. So he has that for him. But yeah, in terms of Formula One, not much to say on those drivers.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why Brancatelli ever raced for Merzario was because, as well as buying the chassis, they bought his contract. Merzario bought Brancatelli's contract. I don't know why, because Brancatelli, I mean, you say he won in, let me just check what his result was in Le Mans. I think let me just check. That was touring cars. That's Le Mans. Yeah, he came second in '89 with Mauro Boldi and Kenny Akerson, two other kind of midfield-ish racing drivers in their F1 careers. I always thought he raced for Osella in 1981, but he never did. And his races with Carlson and Merzario were the only ones in his career, and he didn't qualify for a single race. So make of that what you will. I'm not sure if he was really a terrible driver, or it was just because he drove for two absolutely god-awful teams. Because everywhere else, he seems to have at least got semi-decent results, especially in touring cars where he's won a championship.
Yeah, there are a lot of drivers, to be honest, across any era, but more so in the past, where they may have been pretty terrible in F1, or only did one or two races, often in a really, really bad car, but then did really, really well in lots of other things. I mean, you had, for example, Johnny Cecotto didn't do much in F1, but he was a motorcycle champion. Mike Hailwood, okay in Formula One, but he won, 14 motorcycle Grand Prix titles? It's things like that. And you will get a lot of people who were like serial winners in Le Mans, but in F1, not much happened. And yeah, that's just how it is.
Another one that comes to mind is Vic Elford. He drove, I think it was rally cars in the early 70s, and then moved over to F1 and was a bit shit, to be honest. He was one of those drivers who was kind of in the mix. He was kind of like a Mike Hailwood without the podiums, I think, Vic Elford was.
Yeah, he was like a Porsche factory driver, and he won the Targa Florio a couple of times, and he did well in Le Mans as well. I mean, another one, I suppose, Derek Bell, again, F1 not so much, but again, won Le Mans a few times. Even a modern example, Andre Lotterer, his one race where he completed a lap with Caterham, but then he's Audi driver, he's won Le Mans. I don't think he's won the Formula E title, but he was doing that for a long time as well. It just sometimes that's how it is.
I mean, Lotterer, people kind of overshadow that race he did with Caterham in 2014 because Marcus Ericsson being Marcus Ericsson was incredibly mid throughout his entire career. And Lotterer, first try at being in F1, well, it wasn't his first try because he tested for Jaguar back in the early 2000s, but he beat Ericsson by a second in qualifying.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, people kind of called me out for it because when I did one of my first videos was when I did my ranking of every 2010s drivers, which I desperately need to redo because that video was terrible. I made it 3 years ago. I ranked him as the worst driver. On my basis was the lack of data because he has one lap to his name and he hit a bump and the car stalled, and that was it. Yeah, it depends on the car you get. I mean, even a slightly more easier example to measure would be someone like Brendan Hartley. He had 1 year with Toro Rosso, a couple of points, a lot of bad luck, but then, he did win several WEC titles and Le Mans victories, even if this is mostly an era when Toyota were just competing against themselves. I
mean, the example that I can think of when it comes to other kind of drivers who are good enough, Sebastian Bourdais is a perfect example. He won, 3 or 4 Champ Car titles, came to F1, and what'd you say?
No, just consecutively.
Yeah,
not even.
Yeah, he won. It was 2004 to I think 2007, I think, and then he came into Toro Rosso with Vettel. And the thing is, people often say, "Oh, he was really bad," but he was more unlucky than bad, from what I know. Like he had in Monza, he qualified 4th when Vettel was first, and then I think he stalled on the formation lap or something, and then had to start from the back and never got through the grid. I think Bourdais could have had more potential in F1 if he wasn't in the Red Bull Driver Academy or the driver program.
I think what damaged him was the fact that in 2009, the bad luck had basically gone, but he was being outperformed by a rookie in Sebastian Buemi. I think that was when people were like, yeah, this ain't it.
Yeah, and to be fair, some drivers just don't suit F1. I think that's the bottom line of a lot of it. You get some really performing, really good drivers in endurance who can't hack F1, and some drivers in Formula One who have been atrocious in Formula E or endurance. And, it's not a bad thing. The thing is, we judge your level in Formula One as your level as a driver, when I think that's a bit flawed. When you look at Brendan Hartley, he's one of the best examples. Nedzo mentioned him. He was very mid at Toro Rosso, but in endurance racing, he is seen as a phenomenon. He's consistently one of the most consistent drivers. It makes sense, but it seems like it. But yeah, he's extremely fast there. and people don't remember him in a good light because he just had this surfer hair who just didn't have much to offer.
I mean, wasn't got Brendan Holt. I mean, I think it was Rocket Pile Mohawk called him the first ever trans F1 driver, which is a bit funny because of his hair. But I'm trying to think of what I was gonna say. Because the problem is when you see that, for example, F1 drivers go into endurance racing, they tend to either be really underrated drivers who just didn't get their chance in F1, or mid drivers who are just like, well, the perfect example for me is when Alonso won, was it 2018 or 2019 when he won the Le Mans 24 hour, and his teammates were Sebastian Buemi, who I think is really underrated, and Kazuki Nakajima, who kamikazed into his pit crew in Brazil.
Yeah, it's incredible. And the thing is, I was looking up Merzario in terms of, has he done anything after Formula One and Formula Two? Because, when you look at his Wikipedia page, or if you look at the team's results, it doesn't say anything about what he did after that. But I found out that he's quite active in his racing life, because he's one of those not gentleman drivers, but those vintage drivers who just does shows in basically what the equivalent to Goodwood and Silverstone Festival and those vintage festivals, but in Italy or even South America. So he's been driving old Lotuses and old Ferraris and having a great time. And he still does. So we just said he's 81. He still does interviews. So last year, for Gazzetta dello Sport, which is the main Italian sports newspaper, he had an interview where he said something really interesting, and it goes in line with one of the things I've been thinking about driver level recently. He said that 90 to 95% of point scoring performance in F1 nowadays is due to the car. And all the drivers are so similar in terms of pace, apart from some outliers, which are obvious, that they only produce 10% of the final performance. And that goes in line with what I've been thinking for a few years now. It's that apart from your outliers, Verstappen, Hamilton, Alonso, Leclerc, whatever, Norris, and don't come at me because I didn't say your favorite driver's name, you put Albon and you put Giovinazzi and you put Tsunoda and you put Lance Stroll in the exact same spec car, and they're going to qualify. Somehow it's impossible to do, but if you put them in some reasonably cheap car from Top Gear, they would lap within half a tenth of each other. And yeah, I feel like a lot of drivers from the 70s feel that.
Yeah, I mean, I think driving back then, because it was more about driving talent. Now it's about how smooth you can be, and it is more about the car because of how much training these drivers have had to go through. Like, I think this is an argument I have with a lot of people, especially on social media and in real life, because I used to do a motor sport technology course and university, and a lot of people are very much newer fans, and I have to explain to them that just because a driver raced in a previous era and maybe the field overall wasn't as good doesn't mean they weren't as good. The driver gaps were a lot bigger back in the day, but it doesn't mean that the top level wasn't as good. It's like, for example, people saying, "Oh, Pele wasn't good because he did this or he did that," not realizing that he was at the level he was at another level in his career, just like Messi and Ronaldo. I think it's the same with Jim Clark and Fangio compared to Hamilton and Verstappen and Schumacher.
Yeah, it's like when in football they say they would play against farmers. Yeah, well, they could have been a farmer as well. Just like in F1, you would just race against mechanics who knew how to drive. Well, that was the playing field. You can't change that.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that I think the modern cars are a bit too autonomous. There needs to be more leeway for the drivers to do. I mean, I don't like the whole, the DRS and they have the overtake button where you get all the battery power. It's all a bit artificial. But it is funny how every driver is kind of stuck in their generation of this is how it should be done. Because when Tony Brooks, a few years ago before he died, appeared on Beyond the Grid, he basically said that for him, the beginning of the end for F1 car design was when they moved the engine behind the driver. So literally the first fundamental change to design, and that is like, well, now they've ruined it because now you get so much less feel for it, and it's the car, and the balance is better. The car does half the work, and it's amazing that alone is enough for him to think, oh, well, the driver doesn't do enough.
Yeah, to quote Merzario exactly in that interview, he said he doesn't like Formula One nowadays, not because the drivers are not good enough, but because it has all become too easy. There are a lot of electronic parts of the car which make the driver's job easy. They don't struggle as we used to. Again, those drivers always talking about their period where they really adapt. And that's why you lose the good part of motorsport. Don't get me wrong, the best driver will still emerge, win, and make a difference. So that's just what you hear from all the 70s drivers. I feel like they try not to insult the drivers themselves, because that would be going against the driver etiquette. Obviously, some of them still do, but most of them still try to at least respect that the modern drivers are still very good. But I think they really can't be asked with the current cars and technology, because again, it's easy to see as those old 80-year-olds who are just annoyed at the young drivers having more facility. But they would have to wrestle the car in a lot of cases. As you said, that was the period where you were transitioning from a manual gearbox as well. So they used to have to like fight a manual gearbox through some corner that would send you into death at the right gear.
I mean, I give this example because people say, for example, especially newer fans will say, well, if you put Fangio or Pepe Gonzalez, who was known for being obese, into a modern F1 car, they wouldn't even be able to drive it, or they wouldn't be anywhere near a modern driver. But then they don't like it when I come back to them and say, well, if Verstappen or Hamilton raced in the 50s and they properly tried to drive the cars, they would end up in a tree by 5 laps and they'd probably die.
It would be a mixture of, it would somehow be a mixture of not having the guts to drive it how it should, but also probably being a bit too aggressive with it and driving it beyond its limits, because they're used to cars that have so much more grip.
Yeah.
Definitely. Well, it's nice to see that Merzario himself, even though he didn't have an incredible team under his belt, and as a driver didn't score any podiums, still enjoys, from what we see on his 80-year-old interview, still enjoys racing and still enjoys watching F1, which a lot of older drivers have not done.
It's good that as someone of that era, he's not sounding like a salty old man or like a Nelson Piquet who just he can say whatever he wants about whoever he wants and not get ousted for it. It's good that he seems to be at least trying to uphold a reputation, even if he doesn't really have a reputation outside of nerds like us. It's good that he's trying to do that, and he's not just trying to push an agenda that it was better in his day.
From what I've seen, his favorite driver at the moment is Lewis Hamilton. And as a Ferrari ambassador himself, Merzario, I can guess that he's very happy about the move.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. I didn't know he was a Ferrari ambassador still to this day. I don't know if he does. Does he like promotional stuff for them at any point?
Well, ambassador in terms of he races all cars at those races. He doesn't do promotionals. More than ambassador, I guess, just shower. Like he just brings those cars to shows and just drives them, and he's like,
a sort of exhibition driver in the similar fashion to Esteban Gutierrez with Mercedes, that they get him to drive at Goodwood and stuff like that, instead of doing like simulator work and anything else.
I do wish, with all this talk about older drivers and them saying no, I do wish we had a sort of GP Masters series like what happened in the mid 2000s. I wish we had a series where the older drivers can go against each other and show us what it was like back in, like a time capsule back to a previous era. I don't know how we do that nowadays, because I bet it'd be full of people like Vintatolio Liuzzi and Adrian Sutil and people like that who are kind of mid-rate. Maybe they had like a champions quota or a race winners quota to maybe make it a bit more. But I do think a GP Masters kind of series would definitely make it a lot cooler.
I would love it, but I feel like a lot of drivers are scared of what if they're the slowest in there. Like in essence, it's really fun, right, for fans to just see those old names from midfield teams or backmarkers just having a go at it. But if you're the last, if you end up just finishing last from the spec series, it might just damage their reputation. And also, if they don't get paid enough, I don't think they would care, and that's the sad thing.
I mean, I think there was a couple of drivers, like for example, I think Alan Jones and Andrea De Cesaris were criticised because they were fat, because they were too big to be racing those cars, and people were worried that they would just not be physically able to drive the cars. I mean, Alan Jones, being a no-nonsense Australian, I think it was Christian Danner who initially said it, who obviously drove for Zaxbyed in the late 80s. He said, "Oh, I don't think Alan Jones is good enough because he's overweight." And Alan Jones says, "Well, how many F1 podiums and race wins did you get? And how many championships did you get?" And that kind of silenced that. So I think It's not. I think also the older drivers, especially like you said, all the midfield and back marker teams. I think those kind of drivers would like the exposure more than the money because they're not really getting much money anyway, and the exposure they get is on the floor. So an exposure like, especially if it was properly backed by F1, which I don't think it ever would be, because they've already got their F1 academy, their F2, F3, they've already got so much going on. That I think that wouldn't work for F1 particularly. But if they did like a GP Master Series, which wasn't directly linked to F1, I think that some drivers would definitely, especially if they are backmarker or midfield drivers that weren't ex-champions or ex-podium finishers, I think it would be good.
It would
It's
be.
when you say that because that's the exact reason I've said we could use for how to get drivers on this podcast, because those midfield drivers, those backmarkers, they don't do anything nowadays and no one remembers them. I feel like surely you, just like this podcast, getting them to race in some series where you just say your name is there, people will know you.
Yeah. Like I think for a couple of videos, I have thought about maybe asking them because obviously I do a journalism course at Staffs Uni in real life. So I think that it would definitely help me as not just in my YouTube career, but in my professional career to interview people. Like for example, I think the one I thought of when I was initially thinking of doing a video on him was David Brabham, a great kind of underdog, unknown story, because not only is he the son of a 3-time world champion, not only did he not really get a proper chance at F1 and was actually a better driver than most people remember him as, not only did he have to drag a team through a death that no one predicted and drag them from the back of a grid and try and do something with them, but he had a couple of other stories. Like for example, you could talk about his brother, who everyone knows, Gary Brabham, later turned out to not be the greatest person in the world, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, he's done. He did Beyond the Grid a couple of years back. I mean, Merzario, he's someone who, well, he hasn't done Beyond the Grid yet. Maybe there's still time for him to do it, but it seems like for his age, he's still going strong. Obviously, still driving not racing, but still drives his old cars, and so he's kind of created that kind of legacy after a relatively kind of a modestly obscure F1 career, I think is maybe how to describe it.
C tier, if we're looking at every F1 driver in history.
Yeah, I think so. But I think that brings this episode to a close. So yeah, thank you to Nav as ever. Nedzo, where can people find you on the airwaves?
YouTube, Patreon, if you want to give me some money, because that's what I'm all about. But yeah, my YouTube channel is Nedzo's F1 Gridbox, so I think my Patreon is as well. I'm on Instagram at Nedzo_F1, but I often forget to post that I've done a video because that is not an account that I really use. But yeah, I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. I think I'm on just over 900. So if you could bolster me up to 1,000, it would definitely make me feel like I'm a lot more important than I actually am. So yeah.
You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. You can find us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Make sure to tune in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.